She went into the store to buy sneakers, but the manager thought she was a thief. Calling the police seemed like the right thing to do for him until her father walked into the store. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Tell us in the comments what city you're from. The Grand Crest Shopping Center towered over the bustling city streets, its glass facade gleaming under the afternoon sun. The entrance, framed by sleek silver pillars, welcomed a steady stream of well-dressed shoppers, business executives, influencers, and affluent families, all moving with the confidence of those accustomed to luxury. The air inside carried a blend of expensive colognes, fresh ground coffee from boutique cafes, and the faintest hint of polished marble floors. The entire atmosphere exuded exclusivity, an unspoken understanding that only a certain type of clientele belonged here. Ivy Carter stepped through the glass doors, her heart pounding just a little harder than usual. She had been here before, of course. Her father, the mayor, had taken her and her mother to some of the restaurants upstairs, and she had walked through these halls a few times when tagging along with friends. But today was different. Today, she was here alone, with a purpose, with money she had saved herself, and for the first time she felt the weight of where she was. She adjusted the strap of her crossbody bag, her fingers tightening around the zipper out of habit. She wasn't sure why she felt nervous. Maybe it was the way people walked here, how they carried themselves with a certainty she hadn't mastered yet. Maybe it was the way the security guards, dressed in crisp black suits, stood at the corners of the mall, their eyes scanning the crowds with a quiet scrutiny. Still, she pushed the thoughts aside and focused on the reason she had come. The sneakers. For months, Ivy had been saving up for a pair of limited edition sneakers she had seen online. They weren't just any sneakers, they were a statement, a piece of culture, a way to step into a world she admired from afar. All her friends had them, or at least some version of them. Ivy wanted the real thing, the exact model she had seen in the ads, the one she had imagined wearing with every outfit she owned. The money had been hard-earned, babysitting for her mother's colleagues, tutoring a few kids in math, even skipping her usual weekend coffee runs to put a little extra aside. And now, finally, the day had come. The store had restocked them, and she had just enough to make the purchase. She spotted the store up ahead, its entrance sleek and modern, with bold white letters spelling out Kick Luxe. The glass windows displayed the latest sneaker drops, each pair mounted on minimalist platforms under soft white lighting. Inside, Ivy could see a few customers browsing, mostly older teens and young adults dressed in streetwear. The atmosphere was cool, effortless, exactly the kind of place that would have what she was looking for. Taking a deep breath, she walked in. The moment she stepped onto the polished floor, she felt the subtle shift. The music, a bass-heavy instrumental track, throbbed softly through hidden speakers. The air smelled of fresh leather and new fabric. A few customers barely looked up, too absorbed in their own shopping. But one person did notice her. Behind the counter stood a man, probably in his late 40s, dressed in the store's branded polo and dark jeans. His name tag read Richard. His hair was neatly combed, his sharp features set in a neutral expression. But as his gaze flicked to Ivy, something in his demeanor changed. He wasn't openly unfriendly. His stance didn't shift. His hands stayed relaxed on the counter. But there was something about the way his eyes lingered just a second too long, something about the way his lips pressed together ever so slightly. Ivy felt it instantly. She had felt it before, in other stores, in other places where people looked at her and silently questioned why she was there. It was a feeling she could never quite explain, but she knew it when she saw it. Still, she ignored it. She wasn't here to cause trouble. She wasn't here to waste time. She was a paying customer. She walked past Richard and toward the display wall, scanning the rows of sneakers until her eyes landed on the ones she had been dreaming about. They were perfect. A sleek design, crisp stitching, the kind of craftsmanship that made the price tag worth it. She hesitated only for a second before reaching out, gently lifting one of the shoes to examine it closer. The weight was just right. Not too heavy, not too light. The texture of the leather under her fingertips was smooth, flawless. She turned the shoe slightly, checking the sole, the details, making sure it was exactly what she wanted. Carefully, she placed it back and reached for another pair in a slightly different shade, just to compare. She turned this one in her hands as well, noting the subtle differences. Behind her, Richard was watching. She didn't see him move closer, but she could feel his presence now. He wasn't saying anything, wasn't offering help like he had for the last customer, a young man who had walked in just minutes before her. No, Richard was simply watching. Ivy set the second shoe down and reached for a third. At that moment, she caught a glimpse of Richard's reflection in the glass display. His expression wasn't neutral anymore. His jaw was a little too tight, his posture a little too rigid. He thinks I'm going to steal something. The realization settled in her stomach like a cold weight, but she didn't react. She forced herself to keep moving the way she had planned, to not let it show that she had noticed. She wasn't doing anything wrong, she wasn't breaking any rules, she was just shopping. But Richard's suspicion clung to the air between them, thick and unspoken. She finally made her decision. She picked up the pair she wanted, the exact size, the perfect color. Then she turned to Richard. "I'd like to buy these," she said, her voice calm, steady. For a second, he didn't move. Then, slowly, he stepped forward. "Those are pretty expensive," he said, his tone casual, but the meaning behind it clear. Ivy blinked. She had heard those words before. It wasn't a question. It wasn't even a warning. It was an assumption. She shouldn't be able to afford them. She wasn't supposed to be here. Something hot flared in Ivy's chest, but she kept her expression neutral. "I know," she said. She reached into her bag, fingers brushing against the envelope where she had neatly stacked her bills. She had counted them 3 times this morning, just to be sure. Before she could pull the money out, Richard's gaze flickered toward the front of the store. And then, without another word, he turned and walked toward the counter. Ivy watched as he did something subtle, something almost imperceptible. He pressed a small button beneath the register. Then he picked up the phone. She couldn't hear what he was saying, but she didn't have to. Her heart began to pound, her breath tightening in her chest. She had seen this happen before, on the news and viral videos and stories whispered among friends. She had done nothing wrong. And yet, in Richard's eyes, that didn't matter. Somewhere in the distance, barely audible over the store's music, she heard it. The sound of approaching sirens. Ivy's fingers tightened around the shoebox in her hands, her heartbeat thrumming against her ribs like a war drum. The store suddenly felt smaller, suffocating, its walls pressing inward as a cold sensation crawled up her spine. She had seen Richard's subtle movements, the way his hand had disappeared beneath the register, the way he had picked up the phone with the ease of someone who had done this before. She tried to steady her breathing, but the weight of the moment was settling in fast. She had done nothing wrong. And yet, the faint sound of sirens in the distance was growing louder. Richard still hadn't looked at her since making the call. He was behind the counter now, pretending to be busy, adjusting a stack of receipts or tapping on the register screen, though there was no real transaction taking place. Every now and then, he'd cast a glance toward the front entrance as if waiting. Ivy clenched her jaw, her grip tightening around the shoebox. This isn't happening. She turned toward the door. The two security guards she had seen earlier, the ones patrolling the shopping center, were now stationed just outside the store. They weren't looking at anyone else. Their focus was locked on her. Her stomach turned. She hadn't even paid for the shoes yet. She hadn't even taken them off the display. But it didn't matter. She could hear her father's voice in the back of her mind, the way he had warned her about situations like this, the way he had always reminded her to stay calm, to be smart, to never make a scene even when it felt unfair. Not today. Not here. She inhaled deeply, straightened her posture, and walked toward the register. Richard glanced up as she approached, his expression unreadable, but there was a smugness in the way he held himself now, like he had already won. "I'd like to buy these," she said again, placing the box on the counter. There was a pause, a long, deliberate one. Then Richard sighed, shaking his head slightly, like he was indulging a child who didn't understand the situation. "Look," he said, "I just need to be sure. You understand, right?" Ivy's skin prickled. "Be sure about what?" He exhaled through his nose. "That you can afford these." Her nails dug into her palm. She reached into her bag, pulled out the envelope, and set it on the counter. It wasn't just the exact amount. She had even accounted for tax. The bills were crisp, neatly stacked, proof of every extra hour she had worked, every time she had chosen to save instead of spending. Richard's eyes flicked to the money, but his expression didn't change. If anything, he looked more irritated. "That's a lot of cash," he said, almost like an accusation. Ivy forced herself to stay still. "It's the exact amount." Richard didn't reach for it. He didn't start the transaction. Instead, his fingers drummed against the counter, his lips pressing into a thin line. "You know," he said, voice casual but edged with something sharper, "usually, when kids come in here with this kind of money, it raises some questions." Ivy's breath caught in her throat. There it was. Not an outright accusation, not yet, but enough to make it clear where this was going. "I worked for it," she said, her voice steady despite the heat rising in her chest. Richard didn't respond. He just hummed, tilting his head slightly, like he didn't quite believe her. Behind her, she felt movement. The security guards had stepped inside the store now. They weren't saying anything, but they were close. Too close. Ivy's pulse was racing now, her mind screaming at her to do something, to say something that would make this stop before it escalated further. But then the store door swung open, and the police walked in. 2 officers. One older, graying at the temples, his uniform neatly pressed, his badge polished to a shine. The other was younger, maybe in his late 20s, his gaze flickering between Richard and Ivy as he took in the scene. The older one, his name tag read Sergeant Blake, was the first to speak. "We got a call about a possible theft," he said, his voice firm, professional. His eyes landed on Ivy. "That her?" Richard nodded without hesitation. Ivy's stomach twisted. She turned to the younger officer, whose tag read Doyle. Unlike Blake, his expression wasn't completely neutral. There was a flicker of hesitation there, a brief moment where he seemed to be assessing the situation rather than accepting it at face value. She latched on to that. "I didn't steal anything," she said, forcing her voice to stay calm, controlled. "I came here to buy these." She motioned to the shoebox on the counter, then the cash right beside it. I have the money. I was literally about to pay. Doyle's gaze flickered to Richard. That true? Richard scoffed. She's been acting suspicious since she walked in. Handling different shoes, putting them back, kept checking her bag like she was hiding something. That's not what happened, Ivy said sharply, but Blake had already stepped forward. Ma'am, he said, voice hardening just slightly, I need you to step away from the counter. Ivy's chest tightened. She looked at Doyle, willing him to see through this, to recognize what was happening here. His hesitation lasted only a second. Then, reluctantly, he stepped forward, reaching for his radio. Ivy swallowed, panic creeping in now despite her efforts to stay composed. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. She wanted to protest, to fight back, but her father's voice was in her head again, telling her to be careful, telling her not to make things worse. So she did the only thing she could think of. She reached into her pocket. Not fast, not sudden, just enough to pull out her phone. And she called her dad. I need you at Grand Crest Mall, she said, her voice even but sharp. Now. Blake exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Look, kid, you'll get a phone call at the station. No, Ivy interrupted, gripping her phone tightly. You don't understand. She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze dead on. My father's Mayor Carter. Silence. Blake's expression didn't change immediately, but she saw the slight shift, the recognition of the name, the way his posture stiffened just slightly. Doyle, standing beside him, looked suddenly uncertain. And Richard's face paled. Ivy didn't move. She just stood there, holding her phone, her hands steady now, her voice unwavering. You might want to wait, she said, before you make a mistake you can't take back. And then, somewhere outside the store, past the open doors of the shopping center, past the glass windows reflecting the late afternoon sun, a sleek black town car pulled into the front entrance, and Mayor James Carter stepped out. The moment Mayor James Carter stepped out of the sleek black town car, the atmosphere in the shopping mall shifted. Ivy had never been more relieved to see her father, but she knew better than to show it. This wasn't over. Not yet. The tension still clung to the air, thick and unshaken. She remained perfectly still, her phone still in her grip, as she watched her father approach the entrance of the store. Mayor Carter walked with the presence of a man who was used to commanding a room. He wasn't particularly tall, but he carried himself in a way that made people instinctively move out of his way. His dark suit was immaculately tailored, his expression unreadable, his eyes sharp and calculating as he scanned the scene before him. He took everything in. His daughter standing in the center of the store, the two officers in front of her, the security guards lingering near the entrance, the store clerk watching from behind the counter. And then, finally, he spoke. What's going on here? His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The weight behind it was enough to make the younger officer, Doyle, shift uncomfortably. Even Sergeant Blake straightened his posture, his fingers twitching slightly near his belt. Ivy had seen this before. She had seen the way people reacted when they realized who her father was. Some immediately softened, falling over themselves to apologize, to backpedal. Others, like Blake, hardened, their pride refusing to let them admit they had made a mistake. This was going to be one of those times. Sir, Blake said, clearing his throat, we received a report of a suspected theft in progress. Mayor Carter's gaze flickered to Ivy. By my daughter? Blake hesitated for only a second. Yes, sir. A long, tense silence stretched between them. Ivy watched as her father took a measured breath before shifting his attention to Doyle. The younger officer looked distinctly uncomfortable now, his gaze darting between Ivy and the counter, where the shoebox and the stack of neatly counted bills still sat untouched. "What exactly was stolen?" Mayor Carter asked, his tone eerily calm. Doyle hesitated before glancing at Blake. Blake, however, didn't flinch. "She was acting suspiciously," Blake said. "Handling merchandise, moving around the store, repeatedly checking her bag." Mayor Carter cut him off with a single sharp look. "Did she take anything?" Blake clenched his jaw. "Not yet, but—" "Not yet," Mayor Carter repeated, his voice now dangerously low. He turned to Richard, the store clerk, who suddenly seemed much smaller than before. "Let me get this straight," he continued. "You called the police on a 14-year-old girl who was holding merchandise she planned to buy because you thought she might steal." Richard's mouth opened, then closed again. For the first time since this started, he seemed unsure of himself. Mayor Carter exhaled slowly, turning his gaze back to the officers. "Have you checked the security footage?" Blake stiffened. "We were just about to—" "No," Mayor Carter interrupted. "You weren't. You were about to arrest my daughter." Another silence. Doyle took a step back. "Sir, I can pull the footage now." Blake's jaw tightened, but he didn't stop him. Ivy watched as Doyle turned and gestured toward one of the security guards, who nodded before stepping toward a back office. The tension in the store was unbearable now. Blake looked like he was biting back words, while Richard had gone completely silent, his confidence evaporating with each second that passed. No one spoke as they waited. Ivy's fingers twitched at her sides, her breath coming in steady, controlled inhales. She wasn't going to let them see her crack. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the security guard returned, holding a small tablet. He handed it to Doyle, who tapped the screen a few times before looking up. "It's playing," he said, turning the screen toward the group. Ivy watched as the footage rolled. There she was, walking into the store, browsing the shelves, picking up a pair of sneakers, examining them, placing them back, repeating the process, taking her time. She wasn't stuffing anything into her bag. She wasn't acting suspicious. She was shopping, just like everyone else in that store. The footage continued, showing the exact moment Richard moved toward the register, pressed the alarm button, and called the police. Ivy was still at the shelves, completely unaware of what was happening behind her. And then it ended. Silence. Blake shifted his weight, clearing his throat. "Well, no," Mayor Carter said sharply, his patience gone. "No excuses, no justification." He turned to Richard. "You knew exactly what you were doing when you made that call?" Richard swallowed hard but said nothing. Mayor Carter turned to Blake. "And you," he said coldly. "You walked in here, saw my daughter, and decided she was guilty without a single shred of evidence." Blake bristled. "Sir, we were responding to—" "Bullshit," Mayor Carter snapped. The word cut through the room like a blade, making everyone stiffen. "You didn't investigate. You didn't question. You reacted. You took the word of a store clerk over a teenage girl who had done absolutely nothing wrong." Blake's lips pressed together into a thin line, but he didn't argue. He couldn't. Doyle, on the other hand, looked visibly uncomfortable now, shifting on his feet. He met Ivy's gaze briefly, and there was something like regret there. But regret wasn't enough. Mayor Carter turned back to Richard. "I want your corporate office on the phone now." Richard hesitated. "Now," Mayor Carter repeated, Richard swallowed, then quickly reached for the store's landline. His hands were shaking as he dialed. Ivy barely registered the rest of the conversation. Her father was handling it now. The store, the police, the consequences, he would take care of it. But the weight in her chest hadn't lifted, because even though she hadn't done anything wrong, even though the truth had come out, she still had to prove it. And she knew deep down that if her father hadn't shown up, if she had been just another girl in that store with no one to call, this would have ended differently. The heavy silence that followed the security footage was suffocating. Ivy could feel the weight of it pressing down on her shoulders, the unspoken tension hanging in the air, as if everyone in the store was collectively holding their breath. No one wanted to be the first to speak, but they all knew what had just happened. The evidence was undeniable. Mayor Carter took a slow, deliberate breath. Ivy could tell he was restraining himself, holding back the anger simmering beneath his controlled expression. But she had seen her father in moments like this before. He never raised his voice unless he wanted to, never lost his composure. He had spent his entire career dealing with people who thought they could get away with things like this, and she knew that right now he was calculating his next move. His eyes locked onto Sergeant Blake first. The officer, still standing stiffly with his hands on his belt, met his gaze but said nothing. His jaw was tight, his expression unreadable, but there was a stiffness in his posture, a small but noticeable shift in his stance. He knew he had made a mistake, but Ivy doubted he would admit it. Doyle, on the other hand, looked less certain now. His gaze flickered between Ivy and her father. His lips pressed together as if he wanted to say something, but wasn't sure if he should. He had hesitated before, and now, after watching the footage, he seemed even more uncomfortable. But he still hadn't done anything to stop what had almost happened. Ivy's father didn't look at either of them for long. His attention snapped to Richard next. The store clerk had lost all traces of confidence. The smugness he had carried when calling the police, the certainty in his voice when he accused her, it was all gone. His hands twitched slightly at his sides, and when he realized Mayor Carter was looking directly at him, he shifted on his feet, gripping the edge of the counter as if he needed something to hold on to. "So," Mayor Carter said, his voice calm but sharp, "you called the police on my daughter." Richard opened his mouth, then closed it. "You accused her of stealing, had her surrounded by security, called in officers to intimidate her. And yet, when we look at the footage, all we see is a girl shopping, a girl handling a product in a store, just like every other customer here." He let the words hang in the air for a moment before continuing. "So, tell me, Richard, what exactly made her different?" Richard's throat bobbed as he swallowed. "Sir, I was just doing my job," he stammered. "Your job?" Mayor Carter repeated. His voice was dangerously soft now. "And what exactly is your job? Because as far as I can tell, your job is to sell shoes, not to profile customers, not to make assumptions about whether or not they belong here, and certainly not to waste police resources because you decided that a girl who did nothing wrong wasn't supposed to be in your store." Richard's hands gripped the counter tighter. "Sir, I didn't mean—" "You didn't mean," Mayor Carter cut in, "didn't mean to humiliate my daughter, didn't mean to put her in danger." His voice hardened. "Or didn't mean to get caught." Richard's mouth opened again, but no words came out. Mayor Carter exhaled sharply, then turned back to the officers. "You walked in here," he said, his focus shifting to Blake, "and decided she was guilty. You didn't ask her what happened. You didn't review the footage before making a decision. You saw her, you heard what this man told you, and you chose to believe him." His eyes narrowed. "Tell me, Sergeant, was that just laziness, or was it something else?" Blake's jaw tightened. "Sir, we were responding to a call." "A call based on nothing," Mayor Carter interrupted. "Did you ask this man any questions before you arrived? Did you verify any of his claims before putting my daughter in a situation where she had to fear for her safety?" Blake hesitated for a second too long. That was all the answer Ivy needed. Doyle took a step forward. "Sir," he said, his voice cautious, "we were following protocol, but—" He glanced at Ivy, then at the footage still visible on the security tablet. "I see now that we should have checked the footage before taking any action." Mayor Carter's expression didn't soften. "And yet you didn't." Doyle looked away. Blake's mouth was pressed into a tight line, his pride refusing to let him back down, even though it was clear he had no defense. Ivy stood there, watching it all unfold, feeling a mixture of exhaustion and frustration settle into her chest. Her father was handling this. He was making them answer for what they had done. But no matter how much power he held, no matter how much he could demand accountability, it didn't change the fact that it had happened in the first place. If her father hadn't arrived, what would have happened? Would they have forced her into handcuffs, dragged her out of the store in front of a watching crowd, humiliated and terrified, her protests ignored? Would she have been just another story, another statistic, another headline about a girl accused of something she didn't do? The thought made her stomach turn. Mayor Carter inhaled sharply through his nose, steadying himself. Then he turned back to Richard. "I want your corporate office on the phone. Now." Richard blinked. "Sir, Now," her father repeated, his voice leaving no room for argument. Richard hesitated, then scrambled for the store phone. His fingers fumbled as he dialed, his hands visibly shaken now. Mayor Carter didn't look away from him until he had the phone pressed to his ear, murmuring something in a hushed, panicked voice. Then he turned back to Blake and Doyle. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low. "I expect a full report on why this situation was handled the way it was. I expect an internal review on why your department responded to an unverified accusation without evidence. And I expect to see changes in how your officers approach situations like this in the future." Blake's face was unreadable, but he gave a stiff nod. Doyle simply muttered, "Yes, sir." Ivy knew that was the best they were going to get from them today. Her father let out a slow breath, then turned to her for the first time since he had arrived. "Are you okay?" he asked. Ivy met his gaze. She wanted to say yes. She wanted to act like it hadn't affected her, like she wasn't still shaking on the inside, like her hands weren't still clenched into fists at her sides. But she couldn't. She swallowed, then gave a small shake of her head. Mayor Carter's jaw tightened. He reached out, placed a firm hand on her shoulder. The simple gesture was grounding, a silent reminder that she wasn't alone in this. "Come on," he said, "we're leaving." He turned without another word, guiding her toward the exit. Ivy didn't look back. She didn't need to see Richard's pale face, or Blake's stiff posture, or the way Doyle still looked like he wished he had done something different. She just walked, past the security guards, past the customers who had been watching everything unfold in silence, out of the store, out of the shopping center, into the cool air outside. It should have felt like a victory, but all Ivy could think about was how close she had come to losing everything, and how easily it could happen again. The air outside the shopping center was crisp and cool, but Ivy barely felt it. The tension was still coiled inside her, tight and unmoving, a knot that wouldn't loosen even as she walked beside her father toward the parking lot. Each step felt heavy, her legs stiff, her hands still clenched at her sides. She hadn't spoken since they left the store, and her father hadn't pushed her to. He knew. He understood, but that didn't make it easier. The sleek black town car was parked near the entrance, its driver standing by the back door, waiting. Mayor Carter gave a small nod, and the man stepped aside, pulling the door open. Ivy slid into the seat, exhaling sharply as she leaned back against the leather interior. The door shut, muffling the distant sounds of the city, and for a moment, everything was still. Her father entered after her, closing his own door with a deliberate click. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Ivy could feel his eyes on her, waiting. She stared straight ahead, watching as pedestrians moved along the sidewalk, some carrying shopping bags, others laughing with friends, their conversations easy and light. It felt surreal that just minutes ago she had been inside that store, accused of something she hadn't done, forced to defend herself against people who had already made up their minds about her. Mayor Carter finally spoke. "Do you want to talk about it?" Ivy didn't answer right away. She pressed her fingers into her palms as if grounding herself before finally turning to face him. "What if you hadn't been here?" she asked quietly. Her father inhaled, his expression tightening for just a second before he schooled it back into neutrality. He didn't answer right away, and Ivy knew why. Because they both knew the truth. If he hadn't come, if she had been just another girl in that store, another teenager without a powerful last name, without someone who could demand justice in the span of minutes, things could have gone very differently. "They would have taken me," she continued, her voice low but steady. "They would have arrested me. Or maybe they wouldn't have. Maybe they would have just humiliated me in front of everyone and let me go, but either way, it would have stuck. They wouldn't have listened to me. They didn't listen to me." She turned toward the window, shaking her head. "I did everything right. I didn't do anything wrong, and it still wasn't enough." Her father exhaled slowly, his fingers drumming against his knee. "You shouldn't have had to prove anything," he said after a long pause. Ivy's throat tightened. She wanted to believe that, but the truth was she had spent her entire life knowing that wasn't how the world worked. Her father sat back in his seat, his expression unreadable, but Ivy could see the frustration simmering beneath the surface. This wasn't just about her anymore. It never was. He had spent years fighting against things like this, against people like Richard, against systems that allowed situations like this to happen over and over again. But no matter how many policies he pushed for, no matter how many speeches he gave, it never stopped. And now it had happened to his own daughter. Ivy swallowed hard, her hands tightening into fists. "I want to see the footage," she said suddenly. Her father frowned. "What?" "The security footage," she said, her voice firmer now. "I want to see it again." Mayor Carter studied her for a long moment, as if weighing whether this was a good idea. But then he nodded. He reached into his jacket, pulled out his phone, and swiped through his contacts. "Cynthia," he said when the line connected, "I need you to get me a copy of the security footage from the Grand Crest Shopping Center. The incident at Kick Lux. Yes, as soon as possible." He listened for a moment, then nodded again. "And send a request to the department for a full report on the officers involved." Ivy watched him, her pulse steadying. This wasn't over. Not for him, not for her. Her father ended the call and turned back to her. "I'm going to handle this," he said. Ivy didn't doubt it, but that wasn't the point. "You can't fix everything," she murmured. Her father's jaw tightened. He didn't say anything, and Ivy knew why. Because he wanted to. Because he had spent his whole life trying. The car began moving, the city lights casting shadows across their faces. Ivy closed her eyes for a moment, inhaling deeply, trying to push away the weight of the day. But she knew this feeling wasn't going anywhere, because no matter what her father did next, no matter how much accountability he demanded, the damage had already been done. The next morning, the incident was already making waves. Ivy hadn't checked her phone all night, but when she finally did, the notifications were endless. Messages from friends, classmates, people she barely knew, all asking the same thing. Was it true? Had it really happened? Some were outraged, others were just curious. And a few, just a few, were looking for a reason to justify what had been done to her. She turned off her phone. She didn't want to read the messages, didn't want to see the articles that were already circulating. Her father had been on the phone for hours last night, handling things the way only he could, but Ivy knew that public perception was out of his hands now. The story had escaped into the world, and there was no pulling it back. She sat in the kitchen, stirring her cereal with her spoon without eating it. Her appetite was gone. Across from her, her father was reading over a printed report, his expression unreadable. He was fully dressed already. Navy suit, crisp white shirt, tie perfectly knotted. He looked like a man ready for battle. "They fired him," he finally said, setting the papers down. Ivy blinked, slowly looking up from her bowl. "What?" "Richard Whitmore, the store clerk. He was terminated this morning. Officially, they're calling it a policy violation, but we both know why." Ivy sat back in her chair. It was hard to feel anything about that. He deserved it, obviously, but was that enough? Her father watched her closely, as if trying to gauge her reaction. The corporate office issued a statement condemning racial profiling. They're reviewing their training procedures, and they've sent out a memo to all store employees about bias awareness. Ivy exhaled through her nose, shaking her head slightly. "So that's it? They fire one guy and expect people to forget?" Mayor Carter's lips pressed into a thin line. "It's never just one guy." She knew that. She had always known that. Her father pushed the printed report toward her. "The police department is conducting an internal review on Blake's handling of the situation. There's body cam footage that's being examined, and Chief Reynolds is under pressure to take action. He's not happy about that." Ivy let out a short, humorless laugh. "Good." Her father gave her a small nod, but there was something else in his expression, something wary. "They'll try to spin this," he said. "They always do. They'll say it was a misunderstanding, that the officers were just following protocol. They might even find a way to shift blame onto the store, say they were just responding to a call. The last thing they want is to admit fault." Ivy clenched her jaw. It didn't matter that they had been wrong. It didn't matter that she had been right. People in power never liked to admit when they had messed up. "So, what do we do?" she asked. Her father studied her for a long moment, then reached for his phone. He swiped through his contacts, pressed a name, and lifted the device to his ear. "Cynthia," he said when the line connected, "I need a press release prepared immediately. Yes, regarding Grand Crest. I want a full investigation into the call that was made to dispatch, and I want an internal review on Sergeant Blake. Also, I want a public statement on racial profiling and misuse of emergency services. and make sure the media knows exactly what happened." Ivy's eyebrows lifted slightly. Her father wasn't just handling this quietly. He was going to war. He ended the call and set his phone down. "They want to make this disappear," he said simply. "I won't let them." Ivy swallowed, staring at him. "And what happens now?" Her father exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "Now," he said, "we see how far they're willing to go to cover their tracks." 2 hours later, the first news reports hit the major networks. The headline was everywhere. "Teen accused of theft in luxury store. Mayor's daughter targeted in racial profiling incident." The surveillance footage had been released. It played on every channel, circulating on social media, a glaring reminder of how easily an innocent moment could be turned into an accusation. Mayor Carter was given interviews, addressing the public, demanding accountability. He was calm, collected, but there was fire in his voice, the kind that made people listen. Ivy watched from the couch, her phone vibrating every few seconds with new messages. She ignored them. She had already read enough comments. Some people supported her. Others, predictably, didn't. Maybe she was acting suspicious. Maybe the store was just being cautious. Maybe she should have left instead of making a scene. It didn't surprise her. She had seen it happen before. People always found ways to justify things like this. Her father, however, wasn't giving them the chance. By the afternoon, the police department had issued a formal statement. The official language was stiff and careful, but Ivy knew what it really meant. They were scrambling. Blake had been placed on temporary suspension pending investigation. Doyle, who had hesitated, who had seemed unsure, was cooperating with the review, and Richard Whitmore, the store clerk who had made the call, was avoiding the press entirely. Ivy saw the footage of reporters waiting outside his house, cameras flashing, microphones shoved toward his door. She wondered what he felt now. If he still believed he had done the right thing. If he even realized what he had set into motion. The mayor's office received an official apology from the shopping center's corporate management. Ivy read it twice, searching for any sincerity in the carefully crafted words. It wasn't about her. It was about them saving face. Her father didn't seem surprised. "This isn't about apologies," he told her. "It's about making sure they can't do it to someone else." Ivy believed him, but she also knew that for every time a story like this got attention, there were dozens, hundreds that didn't. That thought sat heavy in her chest. The day passed in a blur of headlines, interviews, phone calls. Ivy stayed in the background, watching, absorbing it all, feeling both at the center of it and somehow distant from it. By nightfall, she was exhausted. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the sneakers she had planned to buy. She didn't even want them anymore. Her father knocked on the door before stepping inside. He didn't say anything at first, just sat down beside her. They sat in silence for a long time. Then, finally, he spoke. "I know this doesn't fix what happened," he said quietly. Ivy exhaled, her fingers running over the fabric of the shoes. "No," she admitted, "but it's a start." Her father gave a small nod. "It is." Outside, the world was still talking about what had happened. The news cycle would continue. More statements would be released. More debates would be had. But Ivy knew that eventually the world would move on. The question was, what would be left behind when it did? The noise of the outside world didn't quiet down. The story had taken on a life of its own, spreading beyond just a local controversy. News outlets picked it apart from every angle. some reporting it as a clear case of racial profiling, others framing it as a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. Ivy had seen the cycle before. The same talking points, the same debates, the same people arguing over whether or not she had deserved what had happened to her. She wasn't surprised, but she was tired. The next morning, she sat at the kitchen table, a barely touched plate of toast and eggs in front of her. Her father was on the phone again, pacing near the window, his voice low but sharp as he spoke to someone about the ongoing investigation. He hadn't stopped working on this since the moment it happened. He had spent the last 24 hours making sure the people responsible felt the weight of their actions, making sure this wasn't something they could brush aside. But Ivy wasn't sure that was possible, because for all the statements and apologies, for all the outrage and demands for accountability, nothing changed the fact that it had happened. She had walked into a store to buy a pair of sneakers, and she had walked out with a weight on her chest that she wasn't sure she would ever shake off. Her father ended his call and turned to her. "You should eat," he said, nodding toward her plate. "I'm not hungry," she murmured. He studied her for a moment, then sighed and sat across from her. "I know this isn't easy," he said. Ivy let out a short, bitter laugh. "That's an understatement." Her father folded his hands on the table, his expression unreadable. "Talk to me." Ivy stared down at the table for a moment, then finally looked up. "You ever wonder how many times this has happened to someone who didn't have a way to fight back?" she asked. Her father's jaw tightened. He didn't answer right away, but he didn't have to. They both knew the answer. All the times this had happened and no one had listened. All the people who had been accused, humiliated, arrested, who hadn't had the luxury of calling someone in power, who hadn't had cameras to prove their innocence. Her father leaned forward slightly. "I think about that every day," he admitted. Ivy swallowed hard. "So, what's the point?" Her father frowned. "What do you mean? What's the point of any of this?" She gestured vaguely toward his phone, toward the printed reports still sitting on the counter. "They fired the store clerk. They suspended the cop. The news is talking about it. But it's still going to happen again. To someone else. And no matter what we do, no matter how much noise we make, it never really stops." The words spilled out before she could stop them. She hadn't realized how much frustration had been building inside her until now, how much anger had been sitting just beneath the surface. It wasn't just about what had happened in the store. It was about the pattern, the exhausting, never-ending cycle. Her father didn't speak for a long time. Then he exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "I won't lie to you," he said. "You're right. It will happen again. To someone else. Maybe tomorrow, maybe next week, and maybe they won't have a way to fight back." Ivy clenched her jaw, looking away. "But that doesn't mean we stop fighting," her father continued. Ivy's eyes flicked back to him. He held her gaze. "The world doesn't change overnight. It doesn't change because of one case or one protest or one investigation. It changes because people refuse to accept it the way it is." Ivy exhaled through her nose. "That's what you've been trying to do, right?" she asked. "Your whole career?" Her father gave a small nod. "It's why I ran for office. It's why I do what I do. And it's why I'm not letting this go." Ivy stared at him. "And you think that actually works?" A faint smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "I think it's the only thing that ever has." She wasn't sure if she believed that, but she wanted to. Her father reached for his phone again, glancing at something on the screen. "I have another meeting in an hour," he said. "The city council wants to discuss implementing new policies on racial bias training for police officers." Ivy blinked. because of this?" Her father nodded. "They're under pressure to respond, and if they don't, I'll make sure they do." Ivy leaned back in her chair, processing that. Maybe it wouldn't fix everything. Maybe it wouldn't stop it from happening again. But it was something. Her father stood, setting his phone down for a moment. "There's a press conference this afternoon," he said. "I'm going to make a statement." Ivy hesitated. "Do you want to be there?" he asked. She wasn't sure. The idea of standing in front of cameras, of being the face of a conversation she hadn't asked to be a part of, felt overwhelming. But at the same time, it felt like she should be there. Like she had to be. She took a deep breath. "Yeah," she said finally. "I do." Her father nodded once. "All right." As he stepped away to answer another call, Ivy picked up her phone again. She stared at the screen for a long moment, then finally opened her messages. She scrolled past the unread ones, past the people who had only reached out now that her name was in the news, until she found the conversation she had been avoiding. Her best friend, Layla, had sent her a text the night before. "You good?" Ivy hadn't responded. She hadn't been sure how to, but now she finally typed back, "I don't know, but I think I will be." She hit send. The world outside was still moving, still talking, still debating. But for the first time in days, Ivy felt like she was regaining some control. She wasn't just a girl in the news. She wasn't just a headline. She was still herself, and she wasn't going to let anyone take that from her. The press conference was scheduled for 3 in the afternoon. By noon, the mayor's office was already a hive of activity. Staff members moved in and out of offices, phone calls buzzed through the air, and the tension of the moment weighed on everyone in the room. The story had grown beyond just one teenager being accused in a shoe store. It had become a debate about racial profiling, about law enforcement, about systemic failures that people either wanted to fix or pretend didn't exist. Ivy sat in the corner of her father's office, scrolling through the news articles. Each one had a slightly different spin. Some focused on the injustice of what had happened to her. Others dissected her father's reaction, wondering if he was using this moment for political gain. Then there were the op-eds, the talking heads on TV, the endless online debates where people who had never met her felt comfortable deciding whether or not she had deserved what had happened. She had expected it, but that didn't make it any less exhausting. Her father sat behind his desk, rubbing his temples as he listened to yet another phone call. He had barely stopped working since the incident. She could tell he wasn't just thinking about her anymore. He was thinking about what came next, about what this moment could mean beyond just their family. When he finally hung up, he looked at her. "You still want to be there?" he asked. Ivy hesitated for only a second before nodding. "I do." He studied her, his expression unreadable. "It won't be easy. Reporters are going to ask questions. Some of them will be supportive, but others," he sighed, "others will be looking for something to twist." "I know." "And you're sure you're ready for that?" Ivy met his gaze, steady and unflinching. "I don't think I ever will be," she admitted, "but I'm still going." Her father nodded slowly, then leaned back in his chair. "All right." By the time they arrived at the press conference, a crowd had already gathered. Reporters, cameramen, city officials, a few protesters holding signs. Some of the signs were in support of her father's call for action. Others weren't. Ivy felt her stomach tighten as they stepped out of the car. She wasn't sure what she had expected, but seeing the crowd made everything feel more real, more permanent. A woman with a microphone spotted her immediately. "Ivy, can we ask you a few questions?" Her father's security detail kept the reporters at a distance. guiding them toward the podium set up in front of City Hall. Mayor Carter stepped forward first, his presence commanding as always. The cameras clicked, the murmuring quieted, and then, with a calm but authoritative voice, he began speaking. "My daughter came here today because she wants to be heard, because this is bigger than her, bigger than me." He looked out over the crowd, his expression firm. "This is about every young person who has been unfairly judged, every person who has been assumed guilty before they even had a chance to speak. What happened to Ivy was unacceptable, and it happens far too often to people who don't have the privilege of a last name that makes people listen." Ivy swallowed hard. Her father turned toward her, his expression softening slightly. "She has her own voice, and she's going to use it." Then, for the first time, he stepped back, leaving her in front of the microphones. For a moment, Ivy felt frozen. The weight of so many eyes on her made her pulse hammer in her ears. She had never spoken in front of this many people before, but she had spent the last 2 days being talked about. It was time to talk for herself. She took a deep breath. "I was in a store," she said, her voice steady. "I was shopping. That's all I was doing. But the moment I walked in, the clerk didn't see a customer. He saw a problem, and no matter what I said, no matter what I did, he had already decided who I was." A few cameras flashed. She kept going. "It didn't matter that I had money. It didn't matter that I was following every rule. It didn't matter that I did nothing wrong. He decided I was guilty before I even had a chance to prove otherwise." Her hands clenched at her sides. "The scariest part isn't that he called the police. It's that when they arrived, they believed him. They didn't ask questions. They didn't check the cameras. They didn't even listen to me. They saw me, they heard his accusation, and they reacted." A murmur went through the crowd. "I was lucky," she continued. "My father is the mayor. I had someone to call. But what about the people who don't? What happens to the kids who don't have someone to fight for them? The ones who don't have cameras proving their innocence? The ones who don't get a press conference, who don't get headlines, who don't get justice?" She let the question hang in the air. Then she took another breath. "This isn't about me anymore. This is about making sure no one else has to go through what I did. This is about making sure the people who are supposed to protect us don't treat us like criminals just because of how we look. This is about accountability. And it starts now." She stepped back. For a moment, there was silence, and then applause. Not from everyone, but from enough. Her father placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, murmuring, "You did good, kid." She didn't know if it would change anything, but at least for once she had been heard. The press conference ended, but the conversations didn't. Reporters scrambled to dissect her words. Officials made calls. The city's police chief announced that bias training for officers would be expanded. Small steps, but steps nonetheless. By the time Ivy and her father returned home, she felt drained. She sat in her room, staring at the sneakers she had wanted so badly just days ago. She had dreamed about them for months. Now they felt like a reminder of something else entirely. A knock on the door made her look up. Her father stepped inside, holding his phone. "It's done," he said. "Blake's resignation was just announced." Ivy exhaled. He didn't apologize, she guessed. "No." She nodded, unsurprised. "And the store? They're changing their policies. Mandatory anti-bias training, clearer protocols for handling accusations. It's not perfect, but it's something." Ivy let out a slow breath. "Yeah." Her father hesitated, then sat beside her. "I know, it's not enough," he said. "It never is. But you stood up today. You made them listen. Ivy thought about the press conference, about the people who had clapped, about the people who hadn't, about the way her voice had sounded over the microphone, steady and unshaken. "I don't want this to be something people forget in a week," she murmured. Her father's lips quirked up in the faintest smile. "Then make sure they don't." She looked at him, really looked at him. Then she picked up her phone, and she started typing. The story wasn't over, and she wasn't done telling it. If you found this story meaningful, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss future content. Watch our next videos for more powerful stories, and explore our channel for more eye-opening narratives. Share this video with others to keep the conversation going.